All right, everybody. Good evening.
That was creepy.
Echo going on. That's not going to be annoying. Good to see you all tonight. We don't have microphones, so I was told this room is acoustically perfect, so I hope you can hear me okay. I'm Jeff Dunn, Director of the Prindle Institute, also Associate Professor of Philosophy, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Courageous Conversations in Ethics. Courageous Conversations in Ethics is a series from the Prindle Institute where we examine challenging moral issues from a variety of perspectives. I wouldn't say they're debates per se, but rather an opportunity for people with different perspectives to engage in productive dialogue. We think at the Prindle Institute that it's pretty important to have these kind of discussions with people who maybe disagree. And while our discussion will be friendly and respectful, I think, we're not going to shy away from, I'm in the middle of them in case someone's we're not going to shy away from disagreement, though. We're going to kind of lead into that here and see where we might disagree. So tonight's event is going to feature a moderated discussion between our two panelists. After this, we'll have an open Q&A with you, the audience, so you can kind of engage in the discussion too. So be thinking as our discussion goes on, if you have questions you'd like to push the panelists on or steer the discussion in a different direction. So let me now introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Smita Rahman, the Johnson Family Professor of Political Science here at DePauw University. Professor Rahman earned her PhD in political science from Johns Hopkins University. Her work is primarily in political theory, and she's especially interested in thinking about how foundational concepts in political theory, concepts such as democracy, become contested in a global context. Her first book, Time, Memory, and the Politics of Contingency, was published in 2014, and she recently co-edited the volume Globalizing Political Theory. Our second panelist is John Park, an associate professor of philosophy at Cal State Sacramento. Professor Park earned his PhD in philosophy from Duke University, but before that, he received his bachelor's degree in philosophy right here at DePauw University. So it's good to have him back on campus. It's good being back. Professor Park's work is primarily in political philosophy, where he focuses on the legitimacy of different forms of government. Especially interesting for our discussion today, I think, is his work blending what's called Confucian meritocracy, which we'll talk about later, with Western democracy. His first book, The Psychological Basis of Moral Judgment, was published in 2021, and he has numerous articles in top philosophy journals. So please join me now in welcoming both of our panelists. Other hat is moderator. So maybe let's start off the discussion in this way. So I was thinking this morning, in one way, the topic of our discussion, democracy, is very timely, right? So democracy is very much in the air right now. Talk of democracy is very much in the air. I just this afternoon went on the platform formerly known as Twitter, X, and I searched for democracy, and just thousands and thousands of hits, people talking about democracy. Both sides talking about how we need to save democracy, how democracy's on the line, there's this important election coming up. So that way, democracy is in the air. On the other hand, although a lot of the word democracy appears, there's not a lot of engagement with what democracy is and why it might be good. And in fact, all sides seem to think they have democracy on their side. So it seems like in one way, democracy is in the air. On the other hand, it's not really being engaged with in sort of a serious way, or at least not in a way we might want to. So I guess my first question, maybe for you, Professor Rahman, and then I'll throw it over here, is just when we're thinking about democracy, how do we understand that term? How do we define democracy? What would you think democracy is?
Sure. So I think, there's a lot of different ways in which you can slice this, but I think maybe I'll start off with a classical definition, and then maybe, since you said it's in the air and it's a timely discussion, I can take the opportunity to talk about democracy and time a little bit. So I think, obviously when you hear the term democracy, right, you think about that Greek root, right? The demos, right? The demos or the people. So you think of democracy as the rule of the people, right? So when I'm thinking about democracy, I tend to start with Aristotle, and I tend to start with Aristotle's Politics, right? And there he defines the virtuous citizen, right? As someone who possesses the ability to both rule and to be ruled in turn, right? So there's already this kind of duality in that concept. What's interesting though is that even though as it has this notion of this openness to either rule or be ruled, Aristotle also associates democracy with tyranny, right? The tyranny of the many. So which kind of hints at both the possibilities, but also the pitfalls of democracy, right? And some of the dangers it can present that I'm sure we'll get into today. But as you were kind of talking about, it seems to be a timely topic, something I've thought about for a while as somebody who works a little bit on time and political theory. Thinking about democracy in that context, the political theorist Sheldon Wolin talked about democracy as requiring kind of a slowing down, right? Or sort of slow time, that the key to democracy was to be deliberate, right? So when we're thinking about democratic deliberation, the need to slow down, to reflect, to kind of take a pause. And that's what we're thinking about, right? Does democracy require slowness, reflection, all of those aspects? But I also think about how, in terms of political time, who we consider to be part of it, right? So I was, I'll stop here quickly, but I was talking to my senior seminar students this week about this notion of segregated time, right? And how what we consider to be political oftentimes gets racialized, right? So who we consider to be part of that political timeline we all share in, because so much of the time, for instance, you hear things like famously during the civil rights movement, right? With MLK writes, letter to a Birmingham jail. And the response he gets from the white moderate that he writes so eloquently about is not yet, right? Not yet. Your time has not come, right? That's the response you get from LBJ for civil rights legislation. So who belongs to political time? Who gets to participate in that kind of democratic deliberation? Who's left out of time, right? Like felony disenfranchisement, right? You don't get to participate once you're a convicted felon. So who becomes part of that collectively, right? So.
Yeah, so I wonder, just point on one thing you said, a lot of things, but the key there, or at least the key definition point seemed to be that very first thing you said, which was the key to democracy is ruling but also being ruled, right?
Right.
And then maybe tying that in what you just said is, some people get to do the ruling,
yeah,
and some people just get to be ruled, right?
Mm-hmm.
And who is it that gets to do that? But that's sort of twin
right.
concept there.
Right.
Right. What do you think, John?
Well, I kind of like how you had set it up in this question sheet when I first got it as general, like maybe a core area or definition of democracy is one in which citizens have an equal say in how we're governed. Now, I'm usually generally suspicious of definitions, a lot of definitions, except maybe in math or logic, because you can usually come up with counterexamples to them. But with that qualification, I think the use of citizens is really important because in certain societies, like in ancient Athens, it was the citizens having equal say, but there were lots of people in that society who were not citizens, right? Like slaves, women, they were not counted within those people who could have an equal say. Even here in the United States, looking at US history, with slaves as well as with slavery, as well as with women, certain states had that you had to own some property in order to vote. So I think rather than have democracy just be generally defined as kind of like ruled by the masses or something like that, but I think more accurate would be focused on citizens, whoever those might be, and then the citizens have an equal say in government. And then going from there, we can have a variety of different kinds of democracies. There's, for example, direct democracies where people actually vote on propositions and actual particular acts that government can partake in, such as whether we should, let's say, go to war against country X or something like that. And then there's representative democracy, where we actually have representatives, and we vote for the representatives, and the representatives represent us and vote for us, right, on particular policy issues. You know, in at least political philosophy, there's a lot of talk about deliberative democracy, where the legitimacy of democracy is based upon deliberation, and the people having kind of debates with each other, town halls and things like that, to learn more about the other side, reasoning and arguing and debating in order to be informed voters. So that's talked a lot about in political philosophy at the time. And I'm sure there's other variations of democracies, but what's interesting also is that democracy itself can be hybridized with other forms of government, like with the UK, with a constitutional monarchy, for example, having democracy with a monarch who's kind of more of a figurehead, but still does a little bit of stuff. And you can have, for example, in California, where I'm from, very strongly kind of this hybrid direct democracy and representative democracy. We vote for representatives. You may have heard Gavin Newsom, for example, our governor. But we also vote on particular propositions that tend to be very pressing. So we have to do this kind of work where each person has to really do the research instead of voting for a representative to do the research for us. Their full-time job. Now here we are with our own full-time job. Then on top of that, have to do the political research if we want to make informed decisions.
So yeah, so the citizens having equal say. I want to pull on one thing there. We quickly went from equal say to voting. I wonder if there's other ways of thinking about what equal say would mean. So for instance, like historically, was it voting or was it a different way of having a say in government?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think if we want to go ahead and talk about voting a little bit, I mean, voting is one mechanism, right? If that voting is one mechanism and it's one way of getting to having an equal say. And I think, you know, I agree completely, like having an equal say or having an equal right to participate in that democratic process, right? However you think about it, but I don't think, for instance, right, as crucial a mechanism as elections are, right, or as voting is to the democratic process, and free and fair elections there are important to stress. To have that, I also think very significant and kind of germane to this discussion is the role that institutions and norms play in the democratic process as well. So, you know, you mentioned how I kind of like to globalize things a little bit. So you know, a couple of different ways to think about this. So when I was working on this globalizing volume in our democracy section, you know, we had a couple of really interesting perspectives. One of them was like my colleague at Irwin College who was writing about the protests in Hong Kong, right, that took place a few years ago. And one of the things he was really looking at was like how these street protests, right, were drawing on a variety of different tactics, right? I'm sure we'll get into Confucianism soon. He was talking about like how they were using Taoist tactics to mobilize in this attempt towards self-determination. In my native Bangladesh, the summer, some of you may have paid attention to the headlines, there was a significant democratic revolution, right, that pushed back against over a decade of what had become increasingly autocratic rule. And I bring this up because it became a movement about self-determination and people having an equal say, not through voting necessarily, but an equal say in determining how they are being ruled. And just as important as voting on an issue or voting for someone is the ability to say no, right? Is the ability to also reject a form of governance or a form of structure. And what's been really interesting to see in the aftermath, just in the last few weeks, is like, yeah, there's a portion of the country that's like, let's move to elections, right? Like elections now, in order to get legitimacy, we need to have an election within the next, 6 to 8 weeks. And you have a significant pushback from what I would say the majority of the country is to say, actually, no, we can't move to elections if we don't shore up the institutions of democracy and safeguard and protect the mechanisms of democracy and also really kind of enhance those cultures and norms of democracy, right? Things like respect for the rule of law, like those play a really important role in how we think about it as well. So elections, yes, absolutely, but also self-determination, protest, right, deliberation, sometimes rejection.
Yeah, there's like different ways you might have to say. Would you say, and I'm kind of curious what you both think about this since we're talking about voting, is voting essential though, necessary to a democracy? Like if there's no voting, then it's not a democracy? Or is that too strong?
Yeah, I think at least historically it's too strong with ancient Athens, especially the democracy that they had a lottery system. So everyone had this kind of equal opportunity by lottery to be elected, to be put into office and hold a job where they got to vote. And there would be rotations with the lottery. So that's another possibility. There's a current political scientist, Helen Landemore, who's really been pushing it. And so it would be interesting to see just with further debate, and maybe it can be put in experimentally in certain maybe small locations to see how well it works. But my initial worry with it is, compared to representative democracy, you could have people being who win by lottery to hold office, but they may lack the motivation of a representative who really wants to be there and learn about politics, learn the ins and outs, and make informed decisions. And also, if everyone has an equal say, and they're continually rotating people in and out, then you could have people just holding office just for one term, and they rotate new people, new citizens in. You won't have that representative who's been there for a while, knows the ropes, knows politics, knows how things work, knows about certain issues, whether it be economic, political science, healthcare, or what have you. We can kind of lose some expertise. In a way, representative democracy was put in significant part to try to stave off Plato's worry about the ignorant masses voting in democracy. Well, let's have people not directly vote on propositions, but let's have them vote for a representative who spent their life learning about stuff and making more informed decisions than the average citizen. But we may kind of lose that if we go to the lottery. It'll be interesting to see.
And that also kind of gets us back to that question of deliberation and experience. Like this comes up a lot of times in debates about term limits, right? And do you and we've had a lot of discussion about gerontology and politics and how much of that experience and time and
perhaps too much might be.
Perhaps too much, right?
Some can be okay.
Right. And I think the lottery question is a really intriguing one, right? And I think at that or meritocracy or a lot of these things that get put around it, but then you always have this kind of fundamental concern about equality and how we put that in tension with a lottery system that gets you there, but do you get an equal say, but wait your turn, to kind of get, to be able to speak in that instance. So I think that's that's an interesting way to think about it.
So I think there's different ways of thinking about what equal say.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there's the lottery example. How about a model where we each get to be king for the day, right? We each get equal say, but for one day, that seems different. Voting seems like a different.
Yeah, we all got here too late for the philosopher king model.
Right.
We would be sad. Get paid really well, but Plato's out of fashion in some quarters at least.
Yeah. Well, so I think there's two distinct challenges to democracy that have already come out. I want to just mention them and then come back to them because I want to talk about what might be good about democracy first. But the first you mentioned the tyranny of the minority, or the majority, tyranny of the majority. And then John, you mentioned the problem of the ignorant masses, right? Maybe these are the same problem, but they might not be the same problem. So maybe we can come back to those in a sec. But part of the reason I think it's interesting to think about what democracy is as a definition is because everybody kind of wants to claim that they're a democracy. It's kind of like a good thing. And so getting clear on what we really mean by democracy seems important. But if we have this rough definition, everyone ruling each other in some sense, or everyone having an equal say, then if we shift to kind of the moral question, what might be morally or ethically good about democracy? I said there might not be some problems too, but what's your pitch if you had to give the pitch for democracy?
Oh, okay. So one way to look at different systems of government is to try to analyze whether a particular system has something we like to call intrinsic value, which is kind of inherent value within the system itself. So we can look at another way of looking at a system of government and measuring what form of government is better than another, like democracy versus monarchy, is to look generally at the history of those systems and see what kind of tends to produce the best outcomes. So that's called instrumentalism. So which system of government is instrumental, can be used as a tool or instrument towards producing good outcomes. And then there's a kind of proceduralist way of looking at things. What kind of system of government has a procedure for putting people into office that itself kind of contains inherent value? And it's thought that regardless of the outcomes of that system, regardless of that system of government produces good outcomes or bad outcomes, it itself inherently internal to it contains value given its procedure for putting people into office. The procedure itself carries moral value. So it's generally thought, at least in Western philosophy, that democracy carries a lot of intrinsic value, inherent value within the very process itself. If you have equal, fair, and free elections. I just listed a bunch of moral concepts. Equality, equal, like everyone has one vote. Fair, just, right? No one has one more vote than another. Everyone gets a say, minorities get a say. And free, right? People aren't forced to choose who they want. They're not coerced at gunpoint, or I'm gonna kill your family if you don't vote this way, right? That freedom itself is also moral value. So those are thought to be inherent within the process of democracy itself. Regardless if democracy produces good outcomes or not, that doesn't matter. It contains intrinsic value. Therefore, it carries a lot of legitimacy. Another one is, and you might be able to speak better on this, given your political science background, is instrumental, whether it produces good outcomes or not. And that itself is an empirical question. And here we can see how empirical social scientific work can actually shed light on a philosophical question about, normatively speaking, whether a system of government is morally legitimate or not. You can actually measure the outcomes. And you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Not my like,
I think
I'm happy about
at least in Western liberal democracies, and by liberal, I don't mean like on the political spectrum being like opposed to conservative. I don't mean the political spectrum at all. I mean something very technical. Liberal democracy, should I mention that? A liberal democracy is a kind of a system of government that was largely spurned by Enlightenment philosophers during the Enlightenment era like John Locke and Rousseau. And basically it's democracy with a bunch of other things like equal rights for everyone, as well as having lots of liberties, lots of freedoms, like freedom to criticize the government, which was very different compared to the times these philosophers were thinking, where they were mostly authoritarian monarchies where you cannot criticize the government. Other things like separation of powers, checks and balances, these are all kind of in a package deal, what's meant by liberal democracy. When you think liberal, you can think freedom, right? We're free. People in a liberal democracy are free. So in liberal democracies, they tend to, I think, produce more liberties than, let's say, authoritarian states, monarchies. This might be contentious, but I think they tend to produce more economic wealth. And I think there is some contention in political science, but I think they kind of rarely have famines. They tend not to mass murder the citizens. They tend to have welfare states that help the poor. Another instrumental value, one given by Aristotle, he said that in a democracy, even though the person who gets elected, you didn't vote for them, you at least got a chance to have your say, and you got to vet your feelings. And that makes the transition of power less likely to be volatile. It brings more political stability in the transfer of power because people at least got to voice their opinion. Now, that's not to say that there can't be insurrections and things like that, which we should all be familiar with, but it's less likely because people had a say.
Yeah, I want to just, before we get to things, just think about that question of legitimacy one more time. Just let me give an example and see if I'm understanding. So imagine you've got one system of government where there's like a monarch, a king, right? Ends up doing a great job though, like just really killing it in the country, right? Like everybody's prospering. And then there's this other country that's got a democratically elected leadership,
Mhm.
and maybe they're not doing so well, right? Like instrumentally, but the thought is there's something better about the democratic elected country, right? So what is it that's better about it? Does that make sense? That question?
Yeah. You're consequential. I think I read your reply. you like instrumentalists about bringing about the good outcomes.
I'm just the moderator.
Okay, I'll try to bring it in. Let me so my stance is, they have these, different theories of legitimacy. They provide different standards on how you determine whether a state, a form of government is legitimate or not, and whether a form of government is more legitimate than another, like whether democracy is more legitimate than meritocracy. So they provide theories, or this is how we're going to measure legitimacy. Once again, instrumentalism is based on producing good outcomes. Proceduralism is having the right kind of procedure that carries value. So my view is, and there are people on both sides, they debate against each other. No, my standards are right. No, my standards are right. I think if there's kind of overdetermination in the sense that both theories, I think, can be sufficient in determining whether a state is legitimate, but neither one of them are necessary to determine that a state is legitimate. So I think they both bring something to the table, and they both can be used. When you so take, for example, the instrumentalism perspective. Let's say we have some kind of absolute sovereign like Marcus Aurelius, a philosopher king, if there ever was one in ancient Rome, who was kind of classically trained in Stoic philosophy, known as one of the last 5 good emperors of Rome. Highly virtuous, like when they needed money to fund the military, he sold like all his art and his gold, like tons of it in his house, to help fund the military. And he was very merciful and things like that to even people who were trying to dethrone him. So, I think it seems odd to say that he wasn't legitimate and that government wasn't legitimate. So I think instrumentalism kind of shines forth there. He brought good outcomes. So we can say that form of government is legitimate, whereas maybe someone who takes a hardline proceduralist view that only the process of democracy is the only system that's legitimate, that at least seems pretty counterintuitive to me. One way I kind of think about it, if you'll abide with me, philosophers like thought experiments, so we're going to engage in some thought experiments. But imagine we're living in the Wild West in a town, right? And there is a mayor, all right, democratically elected mayor. All right, now we can assess whether we think that mayor is legitimate, whether that system of government for the Wild West is legitimate. Now let's imagine a gang of bandits comes in and at gunpoint forces the mayor off. And now the bandits have taken over. Which one would we say is more legitimate? What system of government is more legitimate in this case? I think we would say that democracy is more legitimate, right? But now let's get more narrow and precise. Like in the history of the United States, let's say this mayor was running the town where there was slavery, there was genocide of indigenous people, there was subjugation of women, not allowed to vote, there were sweatshop working conditions for the poor, things like that, all right? But the bandits who came in, took over the mayor's job, makes it such that no more slavery, women have the right to vote, they get to be treated equally as men, no killing of the indigenous, let's help them out, let's create public schools for poor kids, no sweatshop working conditions, there's minimum wage, workers' rights, things like that. In other words, the outcome, the instrumental power of the system of government is tremendous as contrasted with a mayor who allowed for all of these bad things. But the procedure of the mayor being put into office through democracy looks better than the procedure of the bandits who come in. Which one would we say is more legitimate? At least my intuition is it's the bandit system that's more legitimate. And if you can't really see that, imagine you're a minority in that town. How would you see it? So I think, the first thought experiment that we saw, without getting into the details, just here's the democratic elected mayor, here's the bandits, we see the power of the procedure. The democratic procedure carries weight. I think we would want to say the mayor is more legitimate. But now we look at the details, how corrupt and morally reprehensible the mayor was, and how virtuous the outcomes were for the people, for the outlaws. I think we would say the outcomes matter and are more important and override the procedures. But now imagine the mayor, democratically elected, who has the exact same outcomes as the bandits. Makes everything so there's no slavery, no genocide of indigenous, etc. I think we would say that's even better than the bandits, right? That system of government that has both the right procedure and the right outcomes is better. So in a way, I think the mixed view of combining proceduralism and instrumentalism in measuring for legitimacy is more powerful than proceduralism and instrumentalism alone. Although I think all three of them have importance on their own.
No, I like the example. Steve, what do you make of the bandits and?
Yeah, I think I'll leave the thought experiments to
Okay.
philosophers, while I always appreciate a good thought experiment. And I think the conversation about, proceduralism and consequences and outcomes, I think that's an important lens through which to view it. But just to be brief here, since you wanted us to kind of talk about what's, what we think is really good about it. I tend to agree with a lot of what was said in terms of, I think, the strongest case, or the part where I land on, has fundamentally to do with the claims of equality, like equality at the center of the democratic process. And I think my deepest attachment to it, and I think what makes me look at it most favorably, to go back to, we're talking about Locke, but also talking about Rousseau, and I might talk about Rousseau for the positive and maybe also the negative in a little while, right? But self-governance and self-rule, right? So that strikes me as like that's probably my deepest attachment to democracy, as a system of government, right? So thinking about democracy in terms of that capacity and that equal capacity for self-rule, and to kind of further complicate this notion of what and who the self is in that democratic process, right? So that when we're thinking about the self in democracy, yes, of course, we're thinking about an individual self with voting for their self-interest, right? And voting for certain outcomes or certain policy consequences. As you said earlier, Jeff, everybody on Twitter, now known as X, claims democracy, right? Claims that sort of attachment to self-governance and self-determination, and firmly believes they're voting in their self-interest for a good set of outcomes, right? But I think not just in terms of that individual self, but also the collective self, right? And also the ways in which that individual self, right, is enmeshed in that larger collective self as well, right? And how those two things constantly get negotiated, right? So I'm thinking about my individual self-interest, but I also want to be thinking about what we as a collective self need or want, right? And so how do we negotiate or manage that tension? And to me, that is one of the most valuable parts of the democratic process and this whole system of equal self-governance, right, is that those answers are not fixed, they're not predetermined, but that we are always, right, forging, fixing, rewriting, maybe sometimes overhauling, right, this inherited social contract that we're always trying to make better or improve in some ways. Now maybe when we talk about the negatives of democracy, we can talk about how that kind of equal self-determination and self-rule can also go awry, and mass murder may not be off the table, right? So, but we can get to the dark stuff later.
Let me comment on something. It's not exactly what we talked about, but I think it's brought up what we said. So we've been talking about what might be good about democracy overall. Here's a different question, like what might a good democratic citizen do? And I'm intrigued what you said about voting, especially like how people think about voting, whether they're thinking about voting in their self-interest or voting in like the interest of the public or the national interest. Yeah. Do you think, I know there's a debate here, like what should a good citizen do? Are we a good citizen when we vote for our own interests? Is that what we're supposed to do? Or are we a good citizen when we vote for like the common interests.
No, and I think I'm not in the should business as much, but I think what I would say, I think the way in which I look at this, right, is that I think that tension between that individual self-interest and that collective good is an inherent, ineliminable tension of political life, right? And something that we constantly have to navigate and think through. And I think this is where, I depart significantly, I think, from some of my more empirically slanted political science colleagues in that I don't think voters are necessarily rational actors, right? I think when we go into the voting booth, as much as we would like to, and I think we often in a lot of political science literature have a rational actor assumption at the heart of it, right? And I think people do deliberate, people do make cost-benefit analysis on policy, and so you will find voters who will say, yeah, no, I really do care about economic policy, right? Or I voted for this particular candidate because of their stance on the Middle East, or I didn't vote because I don't like what they're saying about Gaza, right? But then a lot of times it's couched in the language of policy. Like you hear this a lot, right? Like I'm sure, if you are paying attention to the election right now, you're consuming every political poll, but you've also, if you're me, you've watched like a gazillion focus groups of undecided voters in swing states, right? And what I hear from a lot of undecided voters in these focus groups are like, well, I want to hear more about economic policy. Or like, I want to hear more about what their economic plan is. And I'm always like, kind of, do you? Like, do you really? Like that's what it's gonna be. It's that nitty gritty of like what your taxation rate is gonna be, right? Because I don't think it's just about that. So that's where I think it's like, what should we vote for versus how do we as these complex individual selves or these subjects who are formed by intersections, these sort of interstices of like politics, culture, society, the economy, how do we actually function? And so I think people vote rationally, people vote for policies. I'm not saying they don't, but people are also swayed by sentiment, they're swayed by culture, they're swayed by communities, they're swayed by inherited traditions. One of the most interesting interviews I heard after that the only presidential debate between Trump and Harris. I was listening to this New York Times podcast that's been following a series of undecided voters. And this one voter from Wisconsin really resonated with me, right? Because she was so visibly struggling with her identity and her sense of herself as a conservative who had voted Republican in every election her whole life. Her whole family were conservatives and Republicans, and it was a very constitutive part of her sense of self. And yet she was struggling with the Republican candidate, but really vexed about whether she could find her way towards voting for a Democrat, right? And to see real people kind of struggling through that set of choices in front of us, just to me calls attention to like the complexity that we all kind of bring, right? Our inheritances, our prejudices, but also things like our attachments, right? And our feelings and our affect and our emotions and our norms that we bring into the voting process. So.
Well, this is a nice, I think, transition to maybe some criticisms of democracy, which are, and I think one of the main ones you kind of hit on with your examples there, which is that sometimes it looks like voters aren't really maybe voting super rationally. I have a family, and not every decision in our family is up for democratic vote. The reason for that is that I have irrational children who would vote in very bad ways, and they have good parents, right? So sometimes we can't have a pure democratic system. But you kind of extend that kind of argument, right, to the broader population. Maybe we're just not good at ruling ourselves. And so I wonder if that leads into some criticisms of democracy, some worries we might have. And, and I guess maybe the way to frame it is not, is there some perfect alternative, but is there an alternative that's better than democracy? Or there's some tweaks we can make? So I wonder if you have any thoughts about this, John.
Yeah, I'm also in the same boat with you. I think the masses generally are not very rational and can't be trusted. There is data showing that most voters, registered voters, around 75% don't know the policy platform positions of the people that they're voting for. They lack a knowledge of criminology and economics to even satisfy their own self-interest, try to figure things out as far as which candidate would satisfy their self-interest. Of course, tons of studies showing tribalism, and what's even more kind of worrisome is that tribalism is higher in those people who know more about politics. So, for example, they'll give and know more about science and math and things like that. For example, there was this one study that gave people various kind of tricky mathematical and scientific problems, and so that way, those who could solve it, they were like, okay, these are the high competence people who know this stuff. And then they would give them scientific data on global warming. And conservatives who are high competence in math and science, they could not look, they kept denying global warming despite insurmountable evidence. Their mind just would not let them do it. So that shows you the power of tribalism. Tribalism, it can be this subconscious influence that just blocks us when it comes to matters of politics, even though we are competent when it's on non-political matters. And so it's kind of like a catch-22. You have people in democracy who are low information. A lot of the data showing that people are low information, which is not ideal in a democracy. But then if you become high information, you're more susceptible to tribalism. So it's kind of like, damn if you do, damn if you don't. So it's this kind of really interesting problem. There's also something called the confirmation bias in psychology that's been found very readily in political psychology regarding just seeing contrary data. You don't register it as contrary data. You think it's actually, you might even think it's data that confirms your position. For example, people are giving conflicting studies on the effectiveness of gun control, and they both think that both conflicting studies support their position, liberals and conservatives equally. So there are these interesting psychological biases kind of hovering around tribalism, right? Evolutionary psychology, cooperation was very huge and was selected for, helped us survive, to stick with the group, work together to defend the tribe, to hunt collectively. That's genetically within us. Of course, genetic determinism isn't true, but in a lot of environments, we will be cooperative and we want to stick with our tribe, we want to stay with our tribe, especially with democracy and large societies. One vote, when looked all by itself, is very unlikely to win the election with your one vote. So there's not much pressure. A lot of people don't feel the pressure. Hey, I need to do the research. I need to vote properly. My vote's not going to really count. So why don't I virtue signal to my tribe and just show, hey, I'm a staunch, Republican or Democrat. I'm going to stick with you guys no matter what. There might be conspiracy theories, but I'll just repeat them. I'm a member of the tribe, right? I'm one of you guys, right? So why not? It's like a buffet of good feelings inside. Hey, I'm a member of the tribe. I belong. So why not partake in that buffet? So I think that's right. And so that's a huge problem with democracy. And I think I think there's lots of things that can be done with democracy to make it better. But one issue I like pushing and thinking about is bringing forth a meritocracy. So meritocracy is ruled by merit. And it's something that was endorsed by the likes of Plato and Confucius in the ancient world. And basically there are merit requirements that you have to satisfy in order to make it into office. So this would be like just any other professional job, like being a doctor, lawyer, engineer, school teacher, police officer, etc. You need to pass certain kinds of merit standards in order to get a job. And when you think about, for example, being the president of the United States, it's just something like natural born citizen, you've lived in the country for 14 years and 35 years of age, right? There's really not any substantial merit requirements for the most important professional job in the country. But for jobs that are far, far less important, we have very rigid merit criteria, criminal background check, things like that. Why not fuse meritocracy with democracy? So ultimately, a democratic vote determines the winner. But in order for someone to run for office and be able to put their name on the ballot, they have to satisfy certain merit criteria, like perhaps a criminal background check, maybe a cognitive check to see if they have cognitive decline due to old age, things like that. Why not put in some merit standards? And it could be up for further debate what merit standards we put in, but it will help make it at least a little bit more likely that our rulers will be more competent, more virtuous, more meritorious, compared to just a democracy in which the floodgates are open, right? You can be a mass murderer, a mass rapist, and you can still become president of the United States, you can still be senator. But why not increase the odds or the likelihood? It won't necessarily lead to always virtuous leaders, but if we can increase the probability of having a more virtuous leader, then that will increase the instrumental value. On an instrumental theory of legitimacy, when we're looking at the outcomes, that will be higher on an instrumentalist calculation.
Yeah, so just to be clear, there's, and then I want to open it up to questions very soon here. But just to be clear, there's been proposals to say there's criteria you have to meet to vote. That's not what you're saying.
Yeah.
But this is more, everybody gets to vote, or all citizens get to vote at a certain age. But there's criteria on who can be elected to office, or the merit criteria.
Yeah, so there's something called an epistocracy, which is put forth by a contemporary political philosopher, Jason Brennan, amongst other social scientists as well. And that's where you have merit criteria in order to vote. All right, so you have to meet certain standards, political competence, in order to vote. If you don't meet them, then you may not be able to vote. Mine is where everyone has one person on vote. Everyone has equal right to vote. It's just that if you want to run for office, put your name on the ballot, just like with any other professional job, you have to pass certain merit standards. Yeah, that's an important. That's an important distinction.
Yeah. Do you have any reactions?
No, I mean, I think the meritocracy point is an intriguing one, and I appreciated the kind of calibration you made there, Jeff, because I think, I think it has value to it, and I think that would be an interesting check. I think what I wanted to speak about a little bit more, and I know we need time for questions here, but what are some of those downsides of democracy that I think I've been hinting at, and I think I kind of want to lead into here in the little bit of time we have left here. So I mentioned Rousseau when I talked about self-governance and self-determination, and I see a handful of current and former students from my introductory class, and you all know this because you've heard me beat this drum before, and we talk about it in class. Because when we talk about Rousseau, we talk about freedom and self-rule and self-governance and all those great things, but we also talk about the darker side of what that means, right? And there's this wonderful, unnerving line in Rousseau where he talks about how we have to obey the general will once that's set up. And this means, and he uses this word, and I love it because there's so much pressure on this one word. He says, this means merely that we will be forced to be free, right? So this notion of force that is at the center or at the heart of this construction of freedom, what does that mean? And what are some of the dangers it contains within itself, right? So oftentimes, direct democracies like the ones he talked about can lead to a tyranny of the majority, right? Without proper constitutional protections for minority rights, right? That's a clear example. We were talking about direct democracy in California earlier, right? And how people can actually go and vote on referendums. Clear example from not that long ago, Prop 8. In California, right, that people might remember, where voters went to the voting booth, right, and took away the ability for gay couples to marry each other, right? They actually voted in favor of a constitutional amendment to ban same-sex marriage, right? So taking a right away from people, right? So democracy can have outcomes like that. We were talking a little bit about tribalism, right? One of the big issues in political science is democratic backsliding that we're seeing all over the world, right? I don't love the term backsliding as much as I want to think about democratic erosion and the rise of illiberal democracies, right? That even though they have the mechanisms of the electoral process, don't have the respect for democratic norms and cultures or the rule of law. And so increasingly democracies become a way for autocratic forms of government to emerge. So I worry about that a lot, and you see this globally in certain areas with the rise of populist movements, right? Oftentimes, these are ultra-nationalist movements that, have echoes of fascism in them, right? So that's something I think about. And I think maybe just because I'm weird and I like to mess with my students' minds, in that same intro class, I always end with totalitarianism. And I always end with Hannah Arendt on totalitarianism. And the reason I do that, because I like to freak the hell out of them at the end of the semester, right? And put them in a really deep dark hole when they think about contemporary politics. But one of the things that Hannah Arendt writes about on the origins of totalitarianism, and she is writing after her experience of seeing Nazi Germany emerge, right, as a German Jewish woman who escaped and moved to America and had a very successful academic career here, she's warning about the dangers of totalitarianism and how it can emerge, right, and what those signs are. And what's fascinating about her argument that I think has significant implications for us still today is for her, democracy plays a key role in it. Right, that there is this very thin line between democracy and totalitarianism. And in her political theory, totalitarian movements emerge actually when the large masses, the masses who have been neutral, apathetic, uninvolved, non-participatory in the democratic process become energized by ideology, by economic crisis, by environmental disaster, whatever it is, and become motivated to go vote. And when they vote without those attachments to democratic norms, institutions, culture, and that's when you see these sort of massive shifts, right? That through the democratic process, it's actually the participation of the apathetic, neutral voters, right? Just getting 2% of those, 3, 4, 5, sometimes you run these numbers in class, can lead to really significant shifts and really kind of alter, what you might think of as a very strong, right, very impregnable, eternal democratic process. All of us who lived through January 6th, I think, have our faith a little bit shaken about where those lines might sometimes be and what that can look like, right? Because January 6th is nothing if not, in some ways, it's absolutely an expression of democracy, right? It's an expression of self-determination. People who very strongly believed, right, that the election was not free and was not fair and that they were not going to be governed by that. At the same time, right, the lack of respect for the rule of law, right, and how it protects and undergirds those individual freedoms we so value as part of that social contract. I think that's really worth thinking about as we move into, in less than 2 weeks, right, or actually in exactly 2 weeks, right, another really significant election. So I'll leave it there.
No, that's a great, bright place to end.
Like I said, it's kind of my specialty at this point.
No, but I think what's interesting too, just in closing, is that the kind of the modification John suggested doesn't actually address that particular problem, right? The tyranny of the majority, right? Because we could have all meritorious leaders who nevertheless are sort of elected by a majority who wants to. So it suggests there's maybe distinct problems here.
I mean, I would love to design a cognitive test that could do that. That would be great. I'm all ears. I would love some ideas.
Right. Well, there's of course much more to say here, but I think it's maybe a good time to sort of wrap up this portion and see if there's any questions here from the audience that you have. We don't have a microphone to pass around, so we'll have a virtual microphone that I'll give to you if you have a question. So just go ahead and raise your hand if you have a question. Kelly, yeah.
So the question about, like, the last thing that you said about something like a disaster, an economic disaster, environmental disasters sparking like interest and involvement for like those masses that were previously uninterested in voting. How would you suggest energizing voters to make our democracy more representative without, having to experience that kind of disaster?
That's a really, really
Offer $1 million.
great question. Offer $1 million, hey, it may or may not be illegal, but worth a shot, right? Like, might lead to a very, very effective voter registration drive. I think it's a really good question, right? And I think what I like, Kelly, what I really like about your question is you took something really, really bleak about, like, the pitfalls of democracy. And I love the optimism inherent in that question, right? Because you're trying to get me to find that promise, right? Like, how could we get those neutral, apathetic voters who didn't really care until, like, the 2008 financial crisis, right? Or, like, I'm going to be dark again, I was going to go back to the Nazis, right? Or to the rise of Hitler, who was democratically elected, right? The economic disaster that happened before, and the high unemployment and the devaluation of currency that took place before that, and so these are moments where those who are rootless, apathetic, who are neutral, are become interested, become more susceptible to ideology that promises a way out, right? And so the ideology component is a whole other one. So how do we kind of get them to be involved and get more representative democracy, as you said, without those dangers? I think it's a great question. I don't want to say we can't, because I still, like, despite all appearances, retain a shred of optimism and kind of romantic hope, and investment in the political process. I think a lot of it, though, civic education really matters, right? Civic education really matters, like establishing norms of, like, tolerance, respectful communication, right? For me, like, a real commitment to pluralism. All of those things, I think, they're not fail-safes, they're really hard. We've been talking a lot in this panel about democracy on the macro level, right? Elections, voting, legislation, but democracy also happens on the micro level, right? Between people, in our interactions, in our conversations. Democracy doesn't just happen in the voting booth or in the halls of Congress. Democratic energy, democratic protests, democratic ideals happen in our interactions with each other, in our openness, our willingness to hear different points of views, to give people that opportunity to be equal in their self-determination, even if we don't necessarily agree with them, right? That commitment to free expression, all of that, I think, goes some way. Not all the way, I don't want to say, because I'm still a little, but it goes some way, I think.
So I have a question. A word that didn't get mentioned, and there's an election in 2 weeks, was parties. Didn't come up at all in either the problems with democracy, or expected to maybe come up, or in the benefits of democracy. How essential is it to have a functioning democracy that there are different political parties? How important is parties as an institution in politics to make democracy work well, or is it where the risk creeps in of tribalism and just identifying with the team rather than actually caring about policies or range of political possibilities? That's kind of the error as part.
Yeah, I think parties can be very dangerous. Like when we talk about tribalism, I think what the tribalism studies show is that modern day Western democracies aren't really about the individual expressing their individual self-interest, but it's really about group interests and party interests. That's what democracy, Western democracy, looks like with the political parties. It's physically possible that there are democratic systems that don't have parties, I think given our human psychology, it will tend to be the case that we gravitate towards political parties, and naturally, I think people will take different stances on certain issues, moral, political issues, and things like that, which will then be ripe for political parties to step in, especially with democracy, because in order to get things to happen, you need numbers, right? You need numbers, and that's one very big disadvantage for minorities is that they are minorities and they don't have the numbers, so they need to attach to a larger group or party in order to try to get the numbers to bring about change. So, it's definitely possible, and a political historian might be able to come up with an example of democracy that had no parties. But I think just given human psychology, I think we'll tend to gravitate that way.
Because one thing that struck me is you mentioned direct democracy, and it seems to me that, we're in America, there's only we have two choices. We can vote for a protest candidate.
Right,
So that means that you have to vote for a party which is likely to represent your position on some policy matters and not on others. Whereas direct democracy, if you're just voting on the policies, maybe it gives you a little way out of that. So it's having maybe more direct democracy, maybe at local level, or offsetting some of the limitations that come with a party system. Some sort of mix like that, a healthier mix.
I mean, it's a good point. You lose some of the checks, but you certainly get more democracy in the process, right? So one thing I was going to add to that, I'm not a fan of this two-party system, right? Like, this is outside my lane. I'm not an American politics person. I don't teach stuff on political parties. But not only do we have a two-party system, we have what's called first past the post, right? At least, and then we don't have proportional representation, right? So this winner takes all system added on to the two-party system, all of this has the effect of diluting that sort of democratic representation you're talking about, right? So I think at these places where you have multiple parties and proportional representation get a little bit closer to that, but I think parties in and of themselves are always partial associations, right? You're not thinking about the collective whole, you're thinking in terms of the interests of that political parties, right? And the same in political science, the party decides, right? The party decides, and then you vote in the interest of that political party, and the system is set up to create gridlock, right? The system is set up to kind of prevent one faction from emerging. So I think it has a whole host of problems, and I don't think we have a very representative democracy as a consequence of that two-party system. Winner takes all. I haven't even touched on the electoral college, and I won't. So we'll just leave that aside for now.
The thing I had as a moderator, I think there's an argument you can make that it's the first past the post system that leads to a two-party.
Exactly.
There's no incentive to have a third party is just spoiler, right? So if you don't have proportional representation, if you don't have a different voting mechanism, you're going to get a two-party.
Exactly. It only serves to funnel you further and deepen, your choices into this binary. That leaves out, I think, most voters, we're talking about the complexities of how people vote. And maybe you check off every box on the Democratic or the Republican platform. I think a lot of us are more complicated than that, right? I maybe like 8 things over here, and I maybe like 2 things over there, or I just like things that are not represented on either side, right?
Yeah.
So as a counterexample to totalitarianism, in which you have a democracy being undermined by itself, one might call to mind examples such as Cincinnati's ancient history, in which a democracy suspends itself to address a very real crisis that affects its society at a very base level. And so seeing that there can be positive elements from having these democracy being suspended in some way. Not always leading towards totalitarianism and genocide and mass murder. Should democracies have some mechanism of at least temporarily suspending themselves to address these crises?
Are you talking about when there's a national emergency or something like that?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I think a lot of democracies do have that measure where it allows for authoritarian power to the head of state. They can suspend civil rights of citizens, checks and balances and things like that in order to very quickly address a national emergency. So that actually, I think, goes back to Hobbes, political philosopher. Hobbes said that the most legitimate form of government is an absolute monarchy. Because if it looks like government and society is gonna break down and crumble, you can think it's like some kind of post-apocalyptic zombie world, it's just gonna be crazy with no government, no police, nothing like that. An absolute monarch can act the quickest, right? Because it's just one person with absolute power. They can make decisions very quickly, right there on the spot, to quell any kind of problem, a national emergency. Whereas if you have separation of powers and checks and balances, well, a lot of times, as we see today, they will fight and bicker, and it takes a long time to get stuff done. So I think a lot of democracies see that kind of virtue. While they don't agree with Hobbes, they see some virtue in Hobbes, that there can be a time and a place for suspending checks and balances and things like that. Civil rights at times too, in order to bring about the greater overall good of keeping a civil ordered society in place.
And, I just wanted to add just a quick biographical note. I really appreciate this question, right? Because I think we don't, we often start from this sort of absolute place, and we hear this all the time, particularly I think growing up in the United States, as many of you have, though certainly not all of you, that democracy is the best form of government, right? And I'm somebody who grew up in Bangladesh under a series of military dictatorships. So actually your question is not hypothetical to me at all. That was my lived reality of the suspension of the state, the suspension of laws was something I actually lived through on a fairly frequent basis, right? Like a state of emergency being declared and like a crisis being declared. And sometimes not always for terrible ends, right? Not always for tanks in the street shooting people, sometimes to just reestablish rule of law, right? Like right now we're living through that moment where, the democratically elected leader, though not in a free and fair election, has fled, right? And we have an interim government that's been given some legitimacy through a democratic movement of protest, right? But is putting in place a whole set of things that many of us think are good and severely needed reforms, right? But are not a consequence of that electoral process. So I do think it's complicated, but having gone through all of that, I think I have a deeper attachment to democracy because I have a sense of what it's like to not have a say in what governs me and how precarious that feels. Yeah.
I have a question. I'm just kind of tied into your points when you mentioned Rousseau and you talked about being forced to adhere to the will of the majority. So I think we can also see the trends in a lot of democracies in today's world, where the will of the majority seems to move in maybe illiberal trend. But then in those cases, it's still legitimate because they're voting and the majority is ruling and they're electing leaders and they feel fitting with their ideology. So to put it in the bleakest terms, like in Germany, where Hitler was actually elected by people who bought into the idea he was selling. What checks or fail-safes are there, if any, when the political culture of a country begins to move in that trend where it's still democratic on paper, but the kind of democracy we're seeing is not, I guess the propaganda, the people who talk about democracy isn't the kind of democracy they thought about, or isn't the kind of democracy we want to see.
Yeah, so that's an interesting phenomenon you pointed out. That's generally, I think, the part of the playbook of fascism is for their leaders to rise through a liberal democracy, to be voted, to rise to power through the legitimate means of democracy, as you say, and eventually they find ways to overthrow power, like what Mussolini did. That's what Hitler did. One check. One possible check might not catch everything is to have the rule of law. So this was one of Aristotle's ideas, is that ultimately people shouldn't rule, the law should rule. You need a constitution. And later the Enlightenment philosophers endorsed constitution to what is a liberal democracy. A liberal democracy should have a constitution where the law rules. We saw something very interesting with the Supreme Court suspending the rule of law for presidents when making presidential decisions. So that's a little scary because now people in charge who rise through democracy it can now potentially break the law and say, oh, it's a presidential necessity decision that I had to do this and lead an insurrection or something like that, or what have you, or overthrow the government. So one possible response that won't solve all problems is have a constitution and have it enforced strictly, the rule of law. That's one possibility as far as standard Western liberal democracy is concerned. Other possibilities, well, I'll just leave it.
That's it?
Well, from what I remember in my political theory class, one of the pitfalls of Rousseau's direct democracy is that it only really works on a smaller scale. So as the state grows, there must logically at some point be like a breakaway moment in which the population grows so large, the entirety of the population can no longer be represented democratically. And if so, is it that the democratic slip is bound to happen if the state grows to an appropriate scale?
Yeah, no, it's such a great question, because, right, as much as I like to teach him and we like to talk about him and think about all of these, like, Rousseau came from, he was born and brought up in Geneva, right? And that sort of direct democracy, it was modeled on the city-state of Geneva, what was a city-state at that point in time. And, it worked with that small number of people, all men, all sharing a similar cultural background, sharing a similar religious identity. I think in those kinds of situations, it can work. But then on a larger scale, when we're wanting to, to get back to where I started, we want to deal with complex questions of race. We want to deal with, what is not a homogeneous population. We want to deal with deep inequalities. I think, the question of direct democracy becomes so much more concerning, right? Because just as it can become, like, to think about that slippage a little more, you can get more, you certainly do get more representation, but you also open up the possibility for persecution, right? And that's where, like, just I'm inherently cautious about it. And so I do think the scale matters, and I do think the population and the makeup of that population matters. I don't think it deals with difference very well, and that's why I'm concerned about it.
And one thing this brings up too, we've been talking about democracy at the level of the nation state, but of course you could have democratic governance at the level of a company,
Or municipal.
or a small town, or you could, a university could be democratically governed or less democratically governed.
That would be
So
interesting.
a family could be democratically governed, so there's these broader questions. Is there a last question or so? We're almost out of time here, but I want to see if there's any. Rich, sorry, did you have a question?
Sure. I think this is for Professor Park mainly. I wanted to hear more about the sort of meritocratic hybrid democracy. Just so historically, right, Greece had some of that hybrid, right, where some people were elected by lottery, if you want to call it that, right? But there were positions of power that were excluded from that. You could, right, had certain military posts, right? You had to have all kinds of experience and training and background in order to be in those posts. And so there was.
Right, the military is typically meritocracy.
Yeah, and so anyway, there's a hybrid like that. And in contemporary US, which I'm most familiar with, right? Our representatives, there's very little qualification.
Right.
But then you have the military leaders who have all kinds of experience. You have the head of the Fed and, right, the cabinet members who have all kinds of training, and you have departments that are permanent, that are filled with experts that they're supposed to be able to rely on. And so we already have a kind of layers of meritocracy built into the sort of structure around our representatives that we elect. And so I'm wondering how there's additions to that you want to put onto it, and how they could work, frankly. So, right, one of the examples I think that you mentioned when you talked about meritocracy, or the studies, empirical studies of people's voting patterns and their tribalism, was about, right, people on the left and the right looking at studies of global warming, right, and your sort of political priors overwhelm your ability to understand the science, even if you're right, scientifically literate in other ways. And so, right, I'm struggling, given that kind of thing, to understand what kinds of meritocratic tests we could give that first could be agreed upon by the swath of people currently in power, right? You'd have to agree on the standards to impose them on future representatives. So in order to get them agreed upon, they presumably have to be pretty watered down, so they wouldn't say, well, you have to understand science the way we liberals do. That's the qualification. So if it's not going to be strong enough for that, right, will be strong enough to do anything. So I'm just curious how the meritocracy is supposed to work and make things stronger than the sort of elements of meritocracy that we already have. So.
Okay, good. So I'm glad you pointed out all those different meritocratic elements of government. So my thesis is mostly for the legislative branch, and at least for the US, the executive branch as well, which do not really have robust meritocracy components. But I think the mere fact that, for example, the Supreme Court is a meritocracy, right? They're supposed to be a meritocracy, but they're put forth, right, based on merit, as well as other ones like the head of the Fed, right? And what's interesting is social science studies show that meritocratically appointed leaders of the Fed or the central bank, do better at inflation than those who are elected, which shows you in Western democracy, these are we're running Western democracy, which shows you within Western democracy how meritocracy can work, a hybrid meritocracy democracy can work. Also judges, a lot of judges, some are elected, some are meritocratically appointed. Those who are meritocratically appointed tend to be cited in journals more than ones who are democratically elected, which from an academic standpoint tends to show that they're smarter. As well as they tend to be more fair in handing out verdicts to those who are within their constituency location. Judges who are elected, they will be more biased towards their constituents because those are the people who are going to be voting. So they're more just. Meritocratically, judges are more just. So all of these examples you point out, maybe some on the Supreme Court side, they show you how meritocracy is a part of our culture, a part of our system, a part of our values already. All right. Technically speaking, our system of government is a hybrid meritocracy democracy. So what I'm saying is we need to bring that meritocracy to the representative branch and the executive branch as well. It is part of our cultural values that we want people who are virtuous and meritorious in office leading our country. I think that's pretty common sense. So let's actually try to take steps doing it. Now you're right pointing out it's going to be very hard to get both sides to agree. Luckily I can pull this philosophical move where I'm saying my thesis is normative, it's about what ought to be. I'm not saying it actually will occur or how hard it's going to be. It's just morally speaking, this is what we ought to do to create a better system of government. It's going to be very difficult to do it. Could potentially take revolution like democracy did to overturn monarchy. But even if we didn't win the Revolutionary War, I'm glad we won the Revolutionary War, but even if we didn't, it still morally is the case that we should be a democracy instead of under a monarchy, right? So I'm just making that moral normative claim. Regardless of whether it happens or not, like whether we won the Revolutionary War or not, morally speaking, we ought to have a meritocracy. It's more likely to raise the probability that we'll have more virtuous leaders. So, in other words, your objection is very good, and I'm kind of taking the sneaky way out.
But how about the last part of that question, which was the sort of, and should it be the liberal standards, the ones that say you have to trust climate science to be elected?
How do you do that?
You can have, so my list of standards, I just said something like criminal background check and check for not having a mental decline due to age. I actually have a more robust list that would require several talks to get through. So I do have more checks. I'm sorry, what was your question? I just want to make sure.
So just the actual standards, right? How do we agree on what the meritocratic standards are so that they don't just reinforce one particular group's conception of the good over the others, and the other feels left out by the definition of the standards themselves.
Right, so there will be no testing based on your political ideology. By political ideology, I mean conservative or liberal in terms of moral values, like in regards to like individual rights or things like that. As far as empirical claims, that's something that potentially could be tested on. Like global warming is an empirical claim. Now, it happens to be the case that different political sides take different viewpoints generally on this empirical claim, but that is a scientific claim. And any scientific, any kind of testing or merit-based testing that brings forth an empirical claim, not a moral claim, a political ideology claim, but an empirical claim, that itself needs to pass the rigor of various government agencies, like NASA, for example. NASA has a website dedicated to the truth of human caused global warming, as well as non-government outside experts, like university professors, people with PhDs in environmental science, for example.
Thank you.
All right, well, with that, please thank our two panelists.
We're gonna run for office again.
There you go. Hi. Yeah.